Welcome to the iLearn Virtual Campus. Please sign up for a free iLearn membership on our website, check out our 7th annual conference coming next spring 2021, and let us know if you're interested in hosting events or leasing space on our campus by emailing campus@immersivelrn.org.
on perception. I'm Adam Jones with the High Fidelity Virtual Environments Lab, High Five Lab at University of Mississippi. And we have 4 excellent papers lined up for presentation today. The first of which is perception of multisensory wind representation in virtual reality. And our speaker will be Gabriel Giraldo from École Centrale du Nance. If we can turn it over to his video, we'll get started. Thank you.
I'm going to present you this research entitled Perception of Multisensory Wind Representation in Virtual Reality. The aim of the experiment was to understand what the wind perception factors are and to see how virtual reality applications could be designed to allow some form of wind reproduction. This to benefit the wind behavior communication in architectural projects. Our prototype was based on wind simulations results, which we rendered in 3 different types of representation. First, the audiovisual representation of mechanical effects of wind is how we perceive the wind presence in a movie, for example, or in one hand by means of streamlines, arrows, colorations, or in different artistic representations. We perceive it by means of its effects in the element context. Then the wind flow visualization, usually found in engineering or architectural representations, in which could be made in one hand by means of streamlines, arrows, colorations, or different elements coming from a wind flow simulation, or in the other hand, could be made by like a handmade sketch. Finally, the actual representations, which are found in the virtual reality field, which could be made using fans or compressed air and using or not a head-mounted device. We use these representations to create and evaluate 4 different conditions. The first one was the reference scene and consisted in an audiovisual representation like a movie in the virtual reality context. Then the wind flow visualization, which was added to the reference scene. The third one was the tactile representation, which was also added to the reference scene. And the last one was all the previous conditions together. We evaluate these conditions in terms of the wind properties, the wind force and wind direction, and in terms of the sense of presence in the virtual reality scene. To make the tactile representation, we installed 8 floor fans in a room equipped with a screen for the virtual reality projections. They were powered on and off using a microcontroller card and a relay module, which received the order from the virtual reality scene. In terms of the virtual reality scene, we used the wind flow simulation results in 2 different ways. For the first one, we created a slide in Paraview software containing the wind flow speed and the direction information of our 3D model, and we imported to the Unity 3D context. Then we plotted like a vector field along the analyzed street. To identify the wind behavior at the avatar position, we created an octagon around it. Each of its surface corresponded to a fan in the virtual reality room. The vectors intersecting a face from the outside were computing to create an average vector. This one was projected in the fan axis to compute the wind speed for each fan. Note that we only use the 4 predefined speed for each fan. The second way as we used the wind simulation results was through the wind visualization of the streamlines in Paraview software. We import this information to the Unity 3D context, and we use it like a loop animation to allow the wind visualization along the analyzed street. The experiment counted with 37 participants. They were given a tablet for the evaluation and noise-canceling headphones. Each participant had to take 4 different visual paths in the same street. Each path was characterized by a type of representation, and each path had 3 different stop points for the wind properties evaluation. The stop points were distributed among 3 different zones to keep similar urban environment conditions. At each stop point, participants evaluated the wind properties using the tablet in terms of the wind force and wind direction. Then they continued the predefined path until the next evaluation point or the end of the path. At the end of the path, participants returned to the desk, and they evaluated a sense of presence questionnaire. Then they restarted the experiment with another type of representation. The results of this study show that according to conditions and types of representation used in our prototype, the tactile condition is the most accurate with regard to wind direction. As far as visual condition, even if the streamlines used are recommended for the 3D visualizations to avoid occlusion or other visual problems, there exist several ways of understanding these elements. In fact, they can be either indicate the global direction of the analyzed street, or they can be considered more locally and seen as some kind of vertex. This might explain why, even if the visual condition was more accurate than the reference scene, it was not good as tactile condition. In terms of the wind force, the visual plus tactile condition was the most accurate. It improved the wind force perception with respect to the visual condition, but it was not significantly different from tactile condition. Regarding the sense of presence evaluation, the visual condition showed a tendency to reduce the presence compared to the reference scene. This can be explained by the fact that we made visible something that it is not in the real world. When adding the tactile effects to the visual representation, the sense of presence was increased compared to the referencing. Even if visual plus tactile is less than tactile condition, this study could be broadened with different visual stimuli. Compared to reference condition, the tactile condition was better, and this is consistent with previous similar studies. Results show a better understanding of the wind properties and the sense of presence with conditions including tactile restitution. The study shows that there may be an interest in the architecture and urban design fields to exploit other types of representations beyond the wind flow visualization and to introduce the wind behavior at different stages of a project. The tactile wind restitution around the project representation could help to simulate or reproduce a possible wind behavior from an urban space. And I thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you, speaker. Gabriel, good talk. And a reminder to the audience that you can type your questions into Whova. This is the probably the preferred way to do this, since these will be persistent after the talk is done, so people can go back and look at them later. So if you have questions, please type them there. In the meantime, I have a question for our speaker. So in your wind simulation, you have fans blowing sort of at an upward angle. Do you think this had any effect in the judgments of presence that you were seeing? Do you think you'd see different effects if, say, they were say not angled upward, but angled strictly inward, say like head height or something?
Yes. That is a thing that we want to analyze in another study, because in fact we think the fact that we have the wind blowing from below could give an impression to the wind. I'm sorry. The stronger wind than a wind coming from the upper localization in the virtual reality room, because normally in a urban space we can feel, or we can feel the wind coming from upside. So that's a thing that maybe can change the user perception, but it's a thing that we really want to analyze.
Excellent. And we have time for another question. If anyone has anything they want to contribute on Whova. In the meantime, or was it fairly uniform for all directions?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
So is the magnitude of error, so you had wind coming from multiple directions throughout the study, and they judged the direction the wind was coming from. Was the error uniform for all directions, or did you notice any biases?
In fact, well, it was computed to bring the global direction in the avatar position.
Okay.
So
we have a Whova question that we can address very quickly. We got about a minute left. In your opinion, why did the tactile condition lead to a higher sense of presence compared to the tactile plus vision condition?
I think it's because of the kind of visual effect used in the study. In fact, I think these trend lines could help to identify different effects, wind effects in a urban space. But for the to identify the wind direction, it could be understood in two different ways. In fact, it could be perceived like a global direction along the street, or like a micro or little effects produced in the specific the specific points of the street, like a vortex or another elements. So I think it could modify the one direction perception. And maybe
okay, if you
sorry.
wrap it up, we're a little over time.
Excuse me, can you repeat?
I'm sorry, I thought you were at the end of your response. If you want to take maybe a couple seconds to wrap up the response, so we can move on to our next speaker and pick these up on Whova with additional replies.
Okay.
Okay, so thanking our speaker, and moving on to our next talk. Up next, we have effects of body tracking fidelity on embodiment of an inverse kinematic avatar for male participants. This presentation is going to be given to us by Ryan McMahon from University of Central Florida. And again, a reminder, please type your questions into Whova. It's been brought to my attention there are two places to do that. One in the Whova chat for this session, and there's a separate question and answer box for each individual paper. I'll be keeping an eye on both of those. So without any further ado, Ryan.
Hello, I'm Dr. Ryan McMahon, and I'm presenting the effects of body tracking fidelity on embodiment of an inverse kinematic avatar for male participants on behalf of my students Coleman Eubanks and Alec Moore and my colleague Paul Fishwick. Many research studies have investigated the sense of embodiment, which is basically processing the properties of a virtual body as if they were properties of one's own physical body. Various embodiment factors have been previously investigated, including visual tactile synchrony, visual motor synchrony, and the fidelity of the virtual avatar to the human user. However, the effects of body tracking fidelity on the embodiment of an inverse kinematic or IK avatar have not been previously investigated. As we look at related work, we can see that prior evaluations of embodiment have looked at perspectives, including third person and first person, different factors, including visual tactile synchrony, threats to the virtual avatar, visual motor synchrony, the fidelity of the avatar to the human user, and also tracking fidelity, which have primarily looked at latency, noise, and full motion capture systems. Different levels of IK body tracking fidelity have not been previously investigated. The goal of our work was to evaluate these effects on the embodiment of an avatar. We had participants perform two tasks. The first task involved adjusting subtle IK parameters via sliders on a floating window. These parameters affected the elbow position, knee position, arm length, and leg length of the IK solver and the IK avatar. The second task was a coin collection minigame in which the participant would walk around a virtual office environment and would collect coins within a 1-minute period. These coins were placed at various positions within the virtual environment so that the users would be able to see their virtual avatar body move around within the virtual environment. With regard to materials, we used an HTC Vive Pro system, including the head-mounted display and 2 handheld controllers. We also used 3 additional Vive trackers, 1 attached to each foot and 1 attached to the back of the participant's waist. We created a Unity application to drive the experiment. This included using the SteamVR plugin for processing Vive input data, and we used the Root Motion Final IK plugin for the inverse kinematic avatar. Our independent variable was the IK body tracking fidelity conditions, which we varied within subjects. Our first condition was the complete condition, which you can see in A. This involved using the tracking data from the head, hands, feet, and pelvis to drive the inverse kinematic avatar. Our second condition, which you can see in B, was the head and extremities condition, which used the head, hands, and feet to drive the inverse kinematic avatar. The third condition, which you will see in C, was the head and hands condition, which only used the data from the head and hands trackers to drive the inverse kinematics. The IK solver would auto-step the feet of the avatar whenever they became too far away from underneath the avatar's head. This would cause misalignments between the virtual avatar's legs and the user's physical legs. And our final condition was the no avatar condition, which still used head and hands tracking, but only the controllers were visible to the participant. Our dependent variables included the Simulator Sickness Questionnaire, or SSQ, the Spatial Presence Experience Scale, or SPS, and a custom embodiment questionnaire, which involved 5 questions that were used in previous studies. These are seen in numbers 1 through 5 in the table, and 5 new embodiment questionnaires that we modeled after questions from the SPES. These are seen numbers 6 through 10. As you can see in the table, we've also identified which embodiment substructure each question relates to, and those include self-location, agency, and body ownership. With regard to the procedure, we decided to conduct 2 studies to avoid lengthy procedures and potential fatigue effects. For both studies, we used the complete and no avatar conditions as control conditions relative to the highest degree of fidelity and the lowest degree of fidelity. In the first study, we also investigated the head and extremities condition. And in the second study, we also investigated the head and hand condition. We used within subject procedures, including counterbalancing using full factorial permutations for each study. And with regard to avatar calibration, we gender matched the avatars. We calibrated the height of the avatars using a T-pose performed by the participants. And we also, as seen in the previous video, used winter gloves on the avatar to avoid any potential racial bias with regard to mismatches between the virtual avatar and the participant. With regard to participants, we originally had intended on recruiting many more participants. However, we only managed to recruit 23 males and 7 females for the first study, and 11 males and 3 females for the second study. And this was due to having to end our studies early due to the COVID-19 pandemic. As a result of the imbalance of male to female data and the potential confound of the gender matched avatars, we decided to only analyze the male participant data from our recruits. Additionally, we found that one of the male participants, his age was more than 2 standard deviations away from the average age of the other males. So we excluded that participant from our data, which left us with only young male-only participants, and specifically 23 males in the first study and 10 males in the second study. The average age for the first study was 19.8 years with a standard deviation of 2.1, and 19 of those participants had prior VR experience. In the second study, the average age was 20.3 years with a standard deviation of 2.1, and 8 of those participants had prior VR experience. With regard to our embodiment results, we first looked at the results of all 10 questions, and we used the Cronbach's alpha to take a look at the internal consistency of those questions. And we ultimately maximized Cronbach's alpha at a value of 0.911 by removing questions 4, 5, and 10. If you recall, questions 4 and 5 were reused from previous embodiment studies, and question 10 was one of the new embodiment questions that we introduced. We averaged the remaining 7 questions to yield the overall embodiment scores that you see here. On the left-hand image, you'll see the results from our first study, in which we found that the complete and the head and extremities conditions yielded significantly higher embodiment scores than the no avatar condition. And we found no significant difference between the complete and the head and extremities condition. However, in our second study, we found that the complete condition yielded significantly higher embodiment scores than both the head and hands condition and the no avatar condition. However, in this study, we found no significant differences between the head and hands condition and the no avatar condition. Our presence results were very similar. Again, these were based on the spatial presence experience scale. In our first study, we found that the complete and head and extremities conditions yielded significantly higher presence scores than the no avatar condition. And we found no significant differences between the complete and head and extremities condition. In the second study, we found that the complete condition yielded significantly higher presence scores than the head and hands condition. However, we found no other significant differences among the three conditions. We believe this is most likely due to the small sample size of 10 male participants. So with regard to the results of our study, our conclusions include the fact that body tracking fidelity increases embodiment. This is supported by the fact that we found that the complete and head and extremities conditions yielded significantly higher embodiment scores than the no avatar condition, and that the complete condition yielded significantly higher embodiment scores than the head and hands condition and the no avatar condition. What was interesting about these results, as you can see, there was no significant difference between the complete and head and extremities condition. However, we did find a significant difference between the complete and head and hands condition. When you look at these two conditions, the head and extremities condition and the head and hands conditions, the only major difference is the lack of foot tracking in the head and hands condition. We believe that this indicates that foot tracking induces more embodiment. And this is primarily due to the fact that when foot tracking is not available, the IK solver must auto step to keep the avatar's feet under the head. And this can result in the virtual avatar's legs not aligning with the user's physical legs. We also found that body tracking fidelity affects presence, specifically it increases presence, with the complete and head and extremities conditions yielding significantly higher presence than the no avatar condition, and the complete condition yielding significantly higher presence than the head and hands condition. It is important to note that our work has limitations, as it is based on a small non-representative sample of only young males, and clearly further research is necessary to further validate these results. Thank you for listening, and I should be available after the presentation to take any questions.
Okay, so thanking our speaker, and we do have time for questions, so please type those in the Whova chat. Okay, we have a couple. The one is why, and I believe you hit on this, but if you could reiterate, why were the women excluded from the data?
Yeah, so originally we had planned on conducting many more participants, but we were obviously sidetracked by the pandemic. So due to that, we were looking at the distribution of the males to female participants, and the ratios were significantly off, and we wanted to avoid any potential confounds due to the male versus female avatars. So we made the decision to exclude the female participants from our data analysis.
And another question from Whova. How did you exactly induce the feeling of embodiment in your study?
Sure. So we actually had two different tasks that the users went through. The first one was we presented them with a floating window that had a number of sliders. These sliders controlled certain aspects of the inverse kinematic avatar. If I remember correctly, things like arm length and leg length. So basically, while they're adjusting these sliders, they would see their avatar move along with their own physical body movements. And then the second task was this coin collection task, where basically they had a minute to collect about, I believe it was 20 coins. The coins were randomly placed around this small virtual office environment. in such a fashion where sometimes you would have to bend down to pick up the coin, sometimes you would have to reach up to pick the coin. So basically this task induces a lot of movement from the users in order to get them to see their virtual body move.
Okay. Thank you. There are more questions on the Hoover, but we're out of time for this talk, and then it can be addressed after the session. So thanking our speaker again, and moving on to our next presenter. The next paper up is Effects of Object Shape, Fidelity, and Luminance on Depth Perception in Handheld Mobile Augmented Reality. This will be presented to us by Tiffany Doe from University of Central Florida. And again, reminder, please send your questions to Huva. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Tiffany Doe, and I'm a member of the XRT lab at the University of Central Florida. Today, I'm presenting our paper, The Effects of Object Shape, Fidelity, Color, and Luminance on Depth Perception in Handheld Mobile Augmented Reality. This paper is about depth perception in augmented reality. We are particularly interested in how a user perceives the depth of objects in augmented reality. Depth perception in virtual objects can be an issue, and depth distortion is cited as one of the most common problems in AR. Inaccuracy in depth perception can cause difficulty for users, especially when depth perception is important for the application. Users may not know where objects are actually placed in the scene, and this can cause confusion and can affect applications and user experience. Distance perception in AR is considered to be inconsistent, and consistent depth cues may improve depth perception. We looked at luminance and color. Luminance and color can affect depth perception of objects in the scene. This is a well-known phenomenon and was actually used in classical paintings by Da Vinci and other painters. We refer to luminance as a relative brightness and darkness of a color. The brightness contrast of a color with the background can affect depth perception, where higher contrast is seen as closer. On the right image, you can see two pairs of squares, bright squares and dark squares. The bright squares on top may seem to pop out at you and be clear squares. This is because the bright squares have a higher contrast with the gray background compared to the dark squares. We refer to color as the hue of a color, where warm colors, such as red, orange, and yellow, are known as advancing colors. This is because they seem to advance forward in the scene. Cool colors, such as blue and purple, are known as retiring or retreating colors because they seem to recede in the scene. On the right, you can also see red, a warm color, and blue, a cool color. The red squares may seem to be closer than their blue counterparts. No prior studies have investigated how luminance and color interact with the properties of 3D objects in handheld mobile AR. We are specifically focusing on handheld mobile AR, which refers to handheld AR systems such as a phone or tablet. This is because handheld AR has become increasingly common due to popularity of smartphones. We conducted a handheld mobile AR depth perception study using the paired comparison method. The paired comparison method is a well-regarded scaling method that places objects along a continuum of quality. In our case, we want to place colors on a continuum of perceived depth to find out which colors look closest to a user. The paired comparison method has been used in many visual stimuli studies. For our study, the participant was shown two objects, and they were tasked with selecting which objects appeared closer to them as fast as possible. Objects were actually at the same depth, but they had different colors and brightness levels. After selecting an object, the participant would experience a brief delay, and they would then be presented with a new pair of objects with different colors. Each color is compared to every other color once. The order of color pair presentation was randomized. Objects had different colors and brightness levels, so our goal was to find out which color and brightness combinations cause objects to look closer or further to a user relative to other colors. On the right, you can see an image of our application. The user sees an object with two different colors. and they're supposed to select which one appears closer to them as fast as possible. We investigated the effects of object shape and fidelity at 2 levels each, for a total of 4 conditions: a cube, a sphere, a low poly bunny, and a high poly bunny. We used a sphere as our simple shape and the Stanford bunny for our complex shape. We considered a cube to be a low fidelity version of the sphere because a cube is considered to be the lowest polyhedral approximation of a sphere. We investigated 6 color hues: red, magenta, yellow, green, blue, and cyan. We also investigated luminance at 2 different levels, bright and dark. Luminance was balanced for each respective level. This gave us a total of 12 color conditions, which can be seen on the screen. Our study was a remote study due to the outbreak of COVID-19. Participants installed an Android application on their phone and printed out a page with AR fiducial markers. They then used the application at a location of their choice and the fiducial markers to do paired comparisons. We had 60 participants, 8 were female, 8 were male. Because our study was a within subject study, each participant looked at all 4 models. We assigned each participant to one of 4 ordering cohorts to counterbalance the presentation order of the 4 models. Each participant had a paired comparison matrix for each object. For each object, the participants' selections and paired comparisons resulted in 66 comparisons of colors, which are captured in a preference matrix for each participant for each object. In this example preference matrix, each cell represents a forced choice decision between 2 colors. A 1 indicates the participant chose the row color as closer than the column color. The far right column shows a total score of each color. In this example, the participant chose red as closer to another color 11 times. They chose yellow as closer to another color 6 times, and so forth. Notice that no color is ever compared to itself. This figure shows the total score of each object when the preference matrices of participants are combined. It also shows perceptually similar groupings. Perceptually similar groupings are underlined, which means that colors in the same group are seen as perceptually similar. Colors in different groups are seen as perceptually distinct, which means that differences in colors cause significant differences in depth perception. For the cube, we cannot say that any colors are perceptually distinct, hence there are no underlying groups. This is due to the cube having a low coefficient of consistency for their selections. Therefore, we cannot say that any color was actually perceptually distinct from another. For the sphere, red, the closest color, was in a perceptually distinct group of its own, which is not the case for the bunnies. This means that the participants found red to be significantly closer than any other color. For all models, all bright colors had an equal or higher total score than all dark colors. Except for the cube, most of the bright colors were perceived as significantly closer than their darker counterparts. The exception to this is the color yellow. Due to our luma balancing, the yellow ended up looking more like brown, which may have caused it to have low scores. Besides yellow, pretty much no bright color is in the same group as its dark counterpart. Increased fidelity also increased perceptual differences among the color and luminance conditions for both simple and complex shapes. Both high fidelity models, the sphere and high poly bunny, have more total perceptually similar groupings and more distinct non-overlapping groupings. These numbers of groupings can be seen here in this table. The high fidelity objects have more groupings than the low fidelity objects, both for total groupings and distinct groupings. This means that participants notice more differences in higher fidelity objects. They notice more perceptual differences among colors. Overall, we found that color and luminance can affect depth perception of 3D objects in handheld mobile AR. The influence of color and luminance on depth perception can vary, depending on the shape and fidelity of a 3D object in handheld mobile AR. High fidelity objects had more perceptual differences than low fidelity objects. Most bright colors were perceived as significantly closer than their darker counterparts. Developers should be cautious when choosing colors, as color and luminance can affect depth perception of objects in an application. Once again, my name is Tiffany Doe. and I should be available for any questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Tiffany. And we do have several questions lined up for you. I suspect we've got more than we can fit in. So please, everyone, be sure to check Huva after the session for any follow-ups. The first question we have is, were both objects in the pairwise comparison displayed at the same depth? And if yes, did the participants know this?
Yes, both objects in the pairwise comparisons were displayed at the same depth. The participants did not know this, and they were just tasked with selecting which object appeared closer to them.
Okay. Another question, just curious if the participants' individual mobile device / technology was recorded, or if you expected or saw any issue with the remote study due to technological differences in the testing apparatus.
We recorded the display size of every mobile device and the screen resolution, since screen resolution and display size seem to be some deciding factors for.
Okay, and given the differences in color response based on display technology, did you see any effect of differing mobile devices? Okay, we may have lost our connection there. In that case, let's go ahead and wrap up this session and or this paper and move on to our next speaker. So again, thanking Tiffany and her colleagues for an excellent talk. All right, so the next paper on the docket is our final paper of the session, Optical Distortions in VR Bias. Yeah, optical distortions in VR bias, the perceived slant of moving surfaces. This will be presented by Jonathan Tong of York University. And again, a reminder, post your questions to Huva, and we'll get as many of them as we can at the end of the session. And without any further ado, our next speaker.
Perceived slant of moving surfaces. Jonathan, and today I will be talking about how optical distortions in virtual reality may bias the perceived slant of moving surfaces. Virtual reality headsets use powerful lenses to focus the display and make images appear at a greater distance from the user. However, due to the non-uniform magnification of lenses, images typically appear distorted. This pincushion distortion can be described as an outward remapping of points in an image based on the radial distance from the optical axis. The greater the radial distance an image point is, the further out that point will be remapped according to the simplified distortion equation. In order to counteract this distortion, the headsets apply an inverse barrel distortion so that it cancels out. However, this is an approximate process, and so there is a possibility of residual distortion. Given this likelihood, it is important to consider whether this will have any perceptual impacts. Here we focus on the perception of surface slant. As illustrated here, positive slants will be in the top away direction, and negative slants in the top towards direction. We had previously shown that pincushion distortion induces an apparent concave curvature in static planar surfaces as predicted by the warping of binocular disparity and perspective cues. This gives rise to an overestimation of surface slant near the bottom and an underestimation or reversal of surface slant near the top. Here we will examine the effect of pincushion distortion on the perception of surfaces in motion. With motion, there is an additional cue called motion parallax. According to this cue, for an observer in motion, nearby points will move across the visual field by a greater degree than more distant points. This is illustrated on the bottom left by motion vectors. Notice the different velocities motion parallax by pincushion distortion is also predicted to result in the appearance of concave surface curvature. In the bottom right, we display a textured frontal surface moving through a pincushion distortion field. Alternatively, as texture elements move across the distortion field and change in magnification, the presence of distortion could become more obvious, and observers might discount it from their local slant estimate. To test these hypotheses and the predictive effects of distortion on slant perception, we carried out an experiment on the Google Daydream View headset with the Google Pixel 2 XL as the display. We selected this particular headset over more state-of-the-art headsets because the Google Daydream software permits customization of distortion correction parameters. In this experiment, observers were first presented with a fixation tone. They were instructed to maintain fixation at this point. Next, a probe dot appeared in one of three locations, either in the top, middle, or bottom portion of the display. After 1 second, a slanted planar surface was presented. Then an adjustment disk appeared. Observers were instructed to adjust the slant of the disk to match the perceived surface slant at the location of the probe dot. We tested a number of different conditions that differed in the presentation of the slanted surface, as seen here. For example, in different conditions, the surface was either moving or stationary. In the motion condition, observers were instructed to move the surface side to side via a rotation of the controller in a side-to-side manner in synchrony with a 1 Hz metronome for 4 clicks. In the static condition, observers were instructed to wait for 4 clicks of the metronome or 4 seconds before advancing. For each of these two conditions, we had 2 other conditions where we varied the level of distortion correction. Either no correction was applied, as shown on the left, or full correction using the pre-distortion coefficients provided by the manufacturer, as shown on the right. Here are the results for these 4 test conditions. But first, let us focus on the static surface condition only. Here, I'm plotting the mean slant estimate aggregated over 8 tested observers as a function of the surface's true slant angle. The gray data points represent local slant estimation near the bottom of the display, yellow the display, and red near the top of the display. The plot on the left shows performance when there was no distortion correction applied, and on the right is when the distortion was fully corrected. The dotted line represents veridical perception. You can see that in the absence of distortion correction, condition. You can see that even with a moving surface, a nearly identical pattern of bias is seen in the presence of distortion. And once again, full distortion correction results in no biases. Interestingly, there's static
Hello, everyone. To let you know, our streamer is having some connection issues. I think in about some seconds or maybe some small minutes, it will come back, okay? I'm sorry about that noise. We are just solving this. Thank you.
top of the display, with slant being underestimated at the top and overestimated at the bottom.
Thanks for your patience. We just reestablished our connection. We're going to put it a little bit back so you don't lose the information, okay? Thanks a lot.
And overestimated at the bottom. This is consistent with the perception of concave surface curvature. With full distortion correction, these biases go away. Now on the right side, I'm plotting the same thing for the moving surfaces condition. You can see that even with the moving surface, a nearly identical pattern of bias is seen in the presence of distortion. And once again, full distortion correction results in no biases. Interestingly, there is no difference between local slant estimation for static versus moving surfaces. In the experiment I just described, we only tested two extreme conditions of either full correction or none at all. But in the second experiment, we investigated whether an intermediate level of distortion correction would result in an intermediate level of bias in slant perception. This intermediate level represents insufficient distortion correction due to the use of incorrect coefficients. We used coefficients for an earlier version of the headset that had less powerful optics. We ran all of these conditions with moving surfaces only. Here are the results for these three conditions for 6 observers. Once again, I'm plotting the mean slant estimate aggregated across all observers as a function of the true slant angle. The different colors once again delineate local slant estimation at different probe locations as shown earlier. In the no correction and full correction conditions, we replicated our previous results, and as predicted, with an intermediate level of distortion correction, we see an intermediate level of bias in local slant perception. Once again, these biases are all consistent with the appearance of concave surface curvature. In summary, uncorrected optical distortions in VR and AR bias local slant perception. The addition of motion parallax cues has no effect on these biases in local slant perception. The amount of distortion in the surface correlates with the size of these bias effects. And finally, residual distortion potentially affects user interaction with surfaces in AR and VR applications, therefore highlighting the importance of sufficient distortion correction. Thank you very much for your attention, and we would also like to say thank you for our sources of funding.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. Excellent talk. Apologies for the technical delays there, but you know, the modern world that we live in. So let's thank our speaker. Excellent. So we do have a couple questions. Let's see. And if you could stick around just briefly after the end of the session, we do have some announcements. But let's see. On Whova, we have a question. People are quite good at overcoming with time the distortion of regular eyeglasses to the point of not noticing it as they switch between wearing and not wearing glasses. Did you look at longitudinal effects with uncorrected displays?
Thanks for the question. That's very true, actually. So people who wear eyeglasses, they tend to adapt very quickly to those optical distortions. Unfortunately, we did not look at longitudinal effects due to the design of the experiment and the kind of questions that we're trying to address. There wasn't enough time, and we couldn't do enough trials to actually properly address temporal effects, like over time, what is the time course of these biases, whether they disappear or whether they continue throughout the experiment. Perhaps in future experiments, we could maybe design it in a way that we could look at possible time course effects of these optical induced biases. Thanks for the question.
Excellent. Okay, so this puts us at the end of our session. Like I said, there are a few comments that are going to be made at the end. So stick around for just a moment, and then let's thank our speaker.
Adam. Thank you all. It was one more great session of ISMAR. So now we have some announcements for social activities. I would like to call to the stage Teddy Chen. Then after these announcements, we are going to have a 15-minute break. We will come back with session 4 at 6:15 Brazilian time. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Hello, everyone. So I hope you're all having a great time here at ISMAR 2020. That was some great work we just saw. And thank you so much for being an awesome audience member. So in about 1 hour and 30 minutes at time 1930 GMT -3, we'll be having a social break. So during this break, we'll be holding some fun events at the expo, at the beach, and also here in the main stage area. So please do check them out at that time. And if you look in the Discord, in the announcements channel, we'll have some more information about the events. And also during your time here, please send us pictures of your time using the hashtag ISMAR2020 or at ISMARConf, either on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. I also just posted that in the chat. So thank you very much. Have a good day.
Guys, and be sure to check Huva in case there are questions we didn't get a chance to get around to during the Q&A.